Well, let's get started. I'm Richard Cronin, as most of you know, but not everybody. And I direct the Southeast Asia program here at the Stimson Center. I want to welcome you to this program, which is a really interesting and timely program, both on behalf of Stimson and the Southeast Asia program. One of the things that Stimson is, I think, known for, and what we work on, is trying to look at issues, difficult issues, and find practical ways to address them. And that almost always involves also trying to getting all the stakeholders into the picture. They're not all here today, but we're going to talk about, we have experts with us today who've already talked about water issues. But so we're very, very proud of that kind of work, and I personally am happy to, this is a very auspicious occasion. It's been 50 years since 1965 when President Johnson sent the first U.S. combat troops to Vietnam. And here we are 50 years later, where no one would have thought, sitting and talking about these issues in U.S. Vietnam relations at the same time as the presidents in Hanoi. So we have, and in addition to the president being in Hanoi, if we think about the issues that have been emphasized in that visit. So not only the U.S. Vietnam joint statement on climate change, but other issues that are being discussed include related issues of water, the drought in Vietnam right now, which is the most serious apparently since 1926. So it's a very, very serious situation. So all of the issues are sort of coming together. We've been working on hydropower dams and their impact on environment and socioeconomic impact, and the trade-offs of energy, water, food security, and other aspects of what people are calling the nexus. So it's all coming together, and it's all coming together at a really important time. I'm going to, without further comment on my part, I just want to introduce the panel, and then we'll get right with it. So many of you know or know of Aaron Salzberg, who's Special Counselor Coordinator for Water at the State Department. And Aaron's been working on these issues of water security and trade-offs among water and other parts of the nexus for a long time. I'm just going to, you all have the bios, so I'm going to be brief on that. And then Todd Johnson, who's the Forestry and Climate Change Advisor at USAID, also with a long career working on these integrated issues of water, forests, watersheds, et cetera. And then finally, my colleague Brian Eyler, who's the Deputy Director of this program, is going to be speaking for not only himself, but also for Courtney Weatherby, our research associate, on what happened during their most recent visit to Vientiane. And you're talking about Kunming or just Vietnam?
I'm talking about Vietnam.
Vietnam.
My trip to Vietnam.
And, yeah, okay. There's some memorable things happened in Vientiane, so it was on my mind. Anyway, so we have a great panel, and all of the issues are going to be touched on, these integrated issues of climate and water issues, drought right now, climate change. So without further ado, you're going to lead off, right? All right. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Rich. And as far as Vientiane goes, for some of those things, what happens in Vientiane stays in Vientiane, right?
Okay. No, it's a good thing. Good thing.
We're willing to share. But I'm going to be talking mostly about my recent trip to the Mekong Delta and Hanoi. In my conversations about Mekong issues in Vietnam and Mekong Delta issues with stakeholders at the national level, you hear more talk about the need to raise Mekong issues, the set of Mekong issues, to the level of national security in Vietnam. And what that means is it's alongside of this conversation that I've heard many, many times, is elevating it to the same level of South China Seas. So that these are the two main foreign policy issues for Vietnam, but also with substantial domestic implications as well. And I think that within that push up to the level of national security interest, there are opportunities for the United States and the U.S. government to be involved with climate change issues, with water management issues, and other sustainable development issues. But in my conversations with officials in Vietnam, I hear things like, there are all these things going on in the Mekong Delta, all these studies from this country and this country helping us out. What we really just need to do is one person or one state to come in and show us the way on how to get this done. And at the same time, I hear this talk of limited capacity, limited human resource capacities in Vietnam to be able to actually deploy the planning and the policy frameworks that need to happen to, again, solve some of these sustainability issues within the Mekong Delta. And again, so you hear this call for help, but at the same time, I'm worried that within this grand, I guess, the architecture of things, that if the U.S. comes in and assists, and the U.S. certainly is coming in and assisting on many of these issues, that there be a bit of over-reliance on the United States. Again, going back to that statement of, we really just need someone to come in and show us how to do this. And within that, there's like, and do it for us, interpretation. So what I hope our conversation can focus on today and later on in the discussion is that to try and avoid this over-reliance in solving sustainability issues. And to use a biblical reference, I think that the way of support is one that teaches Vietnam how to fish and to solve these so that Vietnam can continue solving them on their own. But extending that even further, I think there are opportunities for Vietnam to rise as a leader within the region on solving sustainability issues. So if Vietnam can be taught to fish, then Vietnam can go out and teach others how to fish as well. And there's this kind of virtuous circle that comes as Vietnam rises as a regional leader. And so hopefully within that orientation, there are opportunities for the U.S. to focus on capacity building, particularly in climate change, sustainable development, and advancing cooperative processes related to river basin development. And that's not just in the Mekong, that's in the Red River too, in the north in Hanoi. And to kind of get at some of what I'm talking about, we're going to look at the Delta and the Mekong Delta, because I think the Mekong Delta is a place where this type of orientation can be effectively deployed, or this reorientation, again, to teach Vietnam to fish. Also, the Mekong Delta is a place where I've visited many times, 3 times a year over the last 3 years at least. It's a place that I've found to be very culturally unique, unique music, unique food. It's a place where the people are very laid back. It's kind of this very cool lifestyle, but at the same time, it's a very agriculturally productive, economically productive part of Vietnam. The Delta, for those who aren't familiar with it, sits at the southern end of Vietnam. It does not take up a large portion of Vietnam's total area, only 12%, but 22 million of 90 million in Vietnam live there. The Delta is extremely dense. Compared with the rest of the Mekong Basin, it's 7 times denser. And 22 million in the Delta, if we go up to the next country, Cambodia, with 16 million. And the next country above that, Laos, is 6.7 million. And of course, the next country above that's China, and that's a big one. But within Vietnam, it's this over-engineered space with 60,000 miles of canals, 9,000 miles of dikes, lots of waterworks that send water around this extremely economically productive area. And what looks like roads on this map, this Google Earth drill down, these aren't roads, these are canals and rivers. So life very much is on the water in the Mekong Delta. Have boat, will travel. Cars are totally useless for the most part in the Mekong Delta. A motorcycle and a boat will get you to market, will get your goods to market, and allow one to carry on a pretty robust lifestyle in the Mekong Delta. Delta harvests are robust. From the Delta, farmers are able to pull on average 2.6 rice crops per year. And so that means some are getting 3 crops per year. And it's the area is producing 53% of Vietnam's rice. Vietnam trades off year to year with India and Thailand on the world's top exporter of rice. So it's a major global player in rice production and rice trade. 70% of Vietnam's national fruit crop comes from the Delta, as well as a lot of aqua products. Many of the things that we buy in Harris Teeter and other supermarkets in DC come from Vietnam, shrimp particularly. And so it's extremely productive land. And it's been this way for centuries. Okay. Now I'm going to fast forward to this next slide. I took this picture roughly April 20th last year. This was April 20th this year. They're not the same patties, but they're very close to each other. So this is the drought. This is adjusting to what the new normal is for the Delta, or the new normal pattern of weather, of water, of rainfall, as well as water usage, which will affect the agricultural productivity of the Delta. And some of you have heard about this century drought, as it's called, or the worst drought since 1929. 1926. And it's affected 160,000 hectares of land in Vietnam. That's roughly 3 times the size of New York City, of all the boroughs of New York City. And it's still happening because the monsoon season hasn't hit. So I'm going to talk a bit about what we do know about what's going to happen to the Delta in the future. We do know that this is part of the definite future of the Mekong Delta. Climate change will introduce less water into the system as shorter monsoon seasons, so that spring dry season will extend into the summer. We also know that climate change is bringing in future sea level rise. This one shows how sea level rise will turn the Delta into a series of islands over the next century, with various levels of sea level rise. And this is salinity, which has a tidal effect coming in from the ocean and affects agricultural production. So this is, if sea level rises 1 meter, this is how far the salinity level penetrates into the Delta. These are things we know. Other things we know, some recent results from what's called the Delta Study, which was undertaken by Vietnam's National Mekong Commission, is that dams planned for the Mekong River upstream from the Mekong Delta are going to have a significant impact on agricultural productivity in the Mekong Delta in terms of, 1, silt delivery, because dams built across the main stem of a river or in tributaries hold back that critical flow of silt and sediment coming downstream that's delivered naturally through flood processes throughout the rainy season or the monsoon season. So what this is the baseline assessment of what the Delta looked like. I think we've got an average of 2000, 2008. So the darker the color is, the more silt distribution is happening, and this is a simulated model if 11 dams are created. So we can see that there's a lot less silt, and the numbers show this too. Half the amount of sediment load will be delivered into the Delta if these dams are completed on the main stem. And this also translates into nutrient load as well. So less sediment, and the sediment itself has less nutrients in it. So you're getting less nutrient-rich crops, as well as less robust crops. Another thing that we know is that the sediment flume, so the water doesn't just affect what happens on land, the sediment. Sediment flow going out of the Delta into the ocean affects aquatic ecosystems around the coast of the Delta. And this will affect wild seafood catches of fishermen. This will also affect much of the aquaculture that's happening as well as the overall biodiversity of this marine system. So the greener, or I guess yellow or red, or we don't see any yellow or red in this, shows that less sediment. The green is the amount of sediment flowing out. And what we can see here is with the scenario 1, again, which is those 11 dams, that less sediment is flowing out, and then the sediment flume is not reaching as far around the tip. So that says, again, less plants on the bottom of the marine ecosystem to support kind of the robust animal and agriculture life and activity that support this region economically. So that's what we know. So I went to a conference just a few weeks ago in Cantua on shared water resources management. And I was going there to talk about, one, my hope that Vietnam can get over this short-term perspective of looking at solving Delta issues. You know, to the Vietnamese, particularly the Delta, it's like, oh, are we going to have El Nino next year? What's it going to be like just next year? And unable to see 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead. At the same time, I was hoping that in terms of projects, one of our main kind of policy discussions that we like to promote here is that we believe that damming on the Mekong main stem and on the tributaries is actually slowing down. So it's a critical time for planners to be able to take an overall perspective of strategic planning within the basin, and to not just think about, oh, what about this? What's happening with this next dam that's coming up on the Mekong main stem, or kind of getting away from a dam by dam approach and to begin to think about an entire strategic planning approach. That was my goal, and also to talk about this, what I perceive as this grand opportunity for Vietnam to go to Laos and to discuss purchasing more power from Laos, which would give Vietnam more stake in the game when Vietnam goes to Laos and says, why don't you think about strategically planning your hydropower projects and your power projects in a different way, because there's an economic linkage that's created there. Those were my goals. And I was able to share those perspectives. But I instantly entered the room of this conference to this cacophony of voices and competing voices over what's going to happen within the Delta and what the future of the Delta is going to be. Again, not being able to get past this short-term goal. And they were talking about, all right, we need more shrimp. The future is in shrimp. The future is in rice. The future is in building dikes around entire provinces so that we can get the third crop of rice out of this. The future is in more fruit, okay, because fruit have higher value than rice. The future is in having China to pay for all this damage. That's really what we need to do. And so there's all these different competing voices. And I was particularly kind of dismayed by the China paying for it, because that says that the hierarchy of mitigation within shared water resources has ultimately failed, that they've gone from the avoidance, bypassed the mitigation, and they're already talking about compensation of damages without even knowing what China's contribution to the damages is. So this was really kind of a confusing experience for me and revealing. And the convener of the conference turned and looked at me and said, Brian, and your idea is to have Vietnam rise as a regional sustainability leader? And I said, yeah, there's a lot of work ahead. To get more of an idea about what was happening in the Delta, I jumped in a car and went to tour the Drought. And because I wanted to see the extent of the damage that was being done. And so very much of my journey from Ganta City to the coast into Sok Trang province, about 150 kilometers to the ocean, looked like this. And it got worse as you got to the ocean, because the upstream reaches of the Mekong Delta were getting more fresh water, and the downstream reaches were having the seawater penetration. All right, so less fresh water could be used. And kind of drilling down on some of the things we saw, the taking just a sample of the soil, you saw a very silty, not very nutrient-rich soil in the rice paddy. And a lot of, this is hard to see here, but orange and red coloration, which says there's a high iron content, which also delivers very not nutritionally rich crops as well. And this is evident that, again, the sediment, the robust sediment that comes down through the Mekong itself and is naturally delivered through the flood season is not happening. And then there's overcropping going on that's sucking the nutrients and making the soil very sandy. This is a shrimp farm. Shrimp farms were dry, so the guy that was saying the future is all about shrimp and shrimp investment, because shrimp is what shrimping takes advantage of the salinity that's coming into the delta by mixing it with fresh water to create the brackish water conditions that will enable farmers to raise shrimp. Well, there wasn't enough fresh water available to contribute to that mix, so the shrimp farms were sitting dry. But at the same time, there's all this water around. There's water in the distribution canals. There's lots of water in the Mekong River. This is from the flight. Again, these channels are filled with water. Salt water. It's salt water. It's not river water, again, from the tidal seawater penetration. So I was thinking that maybe the solution is just introducing and ensuring that there's more fresh water in the system throughout the drought period, because we're in a situation where there's drought, but there's water all around us. And then something happened that really blew my mind. We came across intensive agriculture very close to the coastal area, where a farmer and his family were pooling up groundwater at the rate of 80 cubic meters per day to distribute over this daikon field. And he said, all right, in 6 weeks I'm going to replant. I'm going to replant. I'm going to keep doing this process. So somebody's smart within all this, while all those other rice farmers are failing and waiting, oh, what about the drought? But is this the smart way forward? Is over-reliance on groundwater extraction, which sinks the water table and sinks the level of land and only allows more seawater penetration to come in. I don't think that this is the long-term future for the Delta either. So it was a really revealing and really confusing ride to some extent, to show that so much is happening in the Delta, that there's this drought happening, a century drought, alongside of, again, very productive agricultural activity. So I want to shift to a solution and then wrap up. It seems like the biggest problem that's driving a major sustainability conflict within the Delta is rice itself and rice production. It's getting that second and third crop of rice. This is holding development back. This is holding sustainability back within the region. It's producing very little marginal income. The price of rice is relatively low. So what those farmers are gaining from the second and third crop is really not filling their pockets that much. But in their mind, it's easier than transitioning to fruit or other agriculture products. But that third crop of rice, getting into the dynamics, where it's coming from is from these two areas here, the Longshan Quadrangle and the Plain of Reeds, which in 2007 had circle dikes built all the way around them, over 1,000 square kilometer area, to effectively keep out all flood water that's coming down through the Mekong. So 100% control of water distribution, 100% control of the agricultural productivity for a long term throughout the year. But that comes at a high cost, because it costs a lot of money and manpower to build these dikes.
Fertilizer too.
And fertilizer too. That sediment is not being distributed into this over-diked area. And again, that's all for getting at that second and third crop of low-value rice. What it's doing is, from a comparative perspective, is it's not distributing this third crop of rice evenly over the Delta. It's concentrating that production in one or two areas. So it shows a lack of coordination. It also this policy of circle dikes is also producing low quality soil, particularly in that area.
Yeah.
And it's increasing seasonal flooding downstream because the water then that comes through that tight part in the middle is flushed ever so quickly downstream. So what you have, here are some of the dikes that we see. This is the Cambodian border. This is the Vietnamese side. Here's the Cambodian side, diked, non-diked, natural flooding, late in November, late in the year. Downstream is intense flooding in rural areas, and also this is a photo from Cantos in the middle of the city, where people are now dealing with daily tidal floods in October and November, long after the rains have stopped. And the poor are not able to build homes high enough within these cities to prevent water from coming in their homes, where the wealthy are able to stave off that inflow of water. And just to wrap up here, that this also promotes drought because it's not storing water. That those areas are kind of cisterns, potential cisterns to keep water longer into the end of the monsoon season and the dry season, so that if there were a time like now where more water is needed to be introduced in the system, you don't have to call China to say, release water from your dams. It's there for release within the system. So foregoing that third crop of rice could store water long enough to avoid drought. But otherwise, you're exacerbating drought, and you're exacerbating the effects of climate change, and namely permitting deeper and longer penetration of salt water into the system. So that's kind of the conundrum that the Delta is in, or if we look at this through one lens of, if we look at water resource management through one lens of agricultural development. And we can say that China has something to do with this, but the Mekong Delta study results that I mentioned previously said that the effect of the 11 dams are not going to have a huge effect on water flow to the Delta. So that means China's dams now aren't having a huge effect on water flow to the Delta as well. What we need to find out is what are the known factors of water flow contribution, and to come up with some type of coordinated and evenly distributed water energy nexus set of policies within the Mekong Delta that promotes sustainable agriculture, but also sustainable water use alongside of that. So here's the landscape for U.S. engagement. And I hope that today we'll hear more about what the Lower Mekong Initiative is doing from the United States State Department, as well as USAID projects from Aaron and Todd. And I hope that we could think of ways in which these projects can be effectively coordinated to promote a better outcome within the Mekong Delta, and ones that match money with expertise and demonstrate sustainable results, so that there's a demonstration effect to the rest of the region that Vietnam is getting its act together in terms of sustainable uses of water, shifting out of this kind of victim mentality. Again, China is doing all these things to us, from a victim to a leader, to a responsible leader type position within the region, and one that can marshal resources both inside and outside of Vietnam to demonstrate this change. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian. You've really set the scene for us, literally and but also figuratively. And I wanted to comment, by the way. So we put all this emphasis on Vietnam, and we talked to the Vietnamese about, it's not just Lao dams or Chinese dams, etc. You can't blame necessarily your neighbors that much. Although, so the point I was going to make is that the Vietnamese embassy was to be represented here, but because of Obama's being in Hanoi, it's an all hands on deck situation at the embassy. So that's why we don't have a otherwise distinguished speaker from the embassy. The other, just a couple of comments, and that is that although we put this emphasis on Vietnam, there is one area where, again, upstream is very, very important. It's less the flow than it is the sediment issue. And I have a personal experience of Vietnam a long time ago of the dry season. The soil is laterite soil. It is a low-grade iron ore, a lot of the soil anyway. It has very low in nutrients, and so the sediment is required to flow downstream from the mainstream and the tributaries, including the Central Highlands of Vietnam and those rivers, to not just rebuild the delta every year from against the sea, but also the nutrients are critical because and one thing about China's dams is that studies have shown that the lightest silt is the most nutrient rich, and the lightest silt coming from China and northward is what actually gets to the delta, whereas the heavier stuff that's picked up on the way down, scouring the riverbed, etc., is heavier. And so there's this real problem that the more dams that are built, the slower the water runs, the more sediment that's trapped is creating a huge problem. And so even if the mainstream dams are not built, and even if all the planned tributary dams are not built, particularly on the 3S rivers, Saison and Trepak and Mekong, yeah. Even if those don't happen, the delta is already very threatened. And then the other thing is that, and by 2050, some studies show it looks like lace, rather than a stable, landscape. And the other thing is that, but it's also goes back. This is not new. In other words, it's not just the current Vietnamese government or current Vietnamese policy. This started during the French period in the late 19th century of canalizing, channeling the water through the delta, carrying out plantation agriculture. And so it's interesting. I started to dig into a little bit, but I didn't get very far. But like the 1926 drought, of course, was caused by global conditions like this prominent El Nino right now, very strong. But also, it was also what happened to the delta was affected by what was already happening in terms of poor water management. So these are, it's good to remember that these are long-term issues and that they have deep roots, and that includes culture, long-term economic practice, greed, how can we get more out of the soil without, and how more energy out of the water when we can't actually do all those things. Anyway, thank you, Brian. And Aaron, would you like to get started?
Sure, maybe just quickly, because I know we want to move into a discussion.
Right.
But before I do, just to reinforce your point, I mean, when I first started this job maybe 15, 16 years ago, we never talked about sediment. And to be frank, that is probably the most precious resource within this river system. And to be frank, I learned about sediment from this basin, and it's one of the things we don't talk about, but we really do need to elevate, I think, in our discussion. So thanks. And I'll probably take a 60,000 foot view of this and look at this a little bit more regionally. Maybe start, Brian, where you left off. You mentioned the LMI. So I'm a co-chair of the Environment and Water Pillar with our Vietnamese colleagues for the Lower Mekong Initiative. And for those of you who haven't heard about this partnership, its goal is to really strengthen cooperation on shared regional challenges around the areas of health, energy, food security, environment, and water. And the partnership is now entering its sixth year. I think we've invested over $100 million since the inception of the LMI, which has supported over 150 projects covering 200 some odd trainings and workshops and conferences, focused on each one of these different pillar areas and on several cross-cutting themes, including the water, energy, food nexus. So this is a partnership that we started not just because of the importance of the region, and I think you've heard a lot about that, especially with the President's visit, but also in recognition of the essential role that this river plays in sustaining local livelihoods. And perhaps you've heard Secretary Kerry talk about this a couple of times. It's really the engine of growth for the region. And this is something that we often forget, but in many places in the world, rivers really are the backbone of economies. They're what drive economic growth in the region. I think this is particularly true for the Mekong. As the river goes, so does this region. But as we heard from Brian, this region's under increasing pressure from development, pressure from climate change, pressure from growing environmental stresses. And to address these kinds of challenges, the countries are really going to have to start working together. And the real question is will they? And this is the one that we always get. Is there going to be conflict, or will countries work together? To be frank, I'm not sure that there's an alternative. And I think the countries see this. Countries will need to work together if they're going to continue to meet their food, energy, and water needs, and if they're going to realize the full economic benefits that the river has to offer without prejudicing their futures. So I think cooperation, this isn't a choice. I think it's the only option for these countries going forward. And I think they've gotten that message. The question is, what does cooperation really look like? What does this mean for this region, and what are the areas that they need to work on? And Brian, I think you already mentioned a number of these, but the first is clearly data and data for decision making. We need better data. We need better models. We need better ways of getting the data and this information into the hands of decision makers, policy makers, technical experts, but even local communities. Farmers need better data to make decisions about when they plant, how they manage their water resources. We're now seeing, as Brian showed, examples of local farmers using groundwater. Now, how do you manage those systems? When is it going to rain 6 months from now? How do you plan on when to put water into your groundwater, when to take water out of your ground? Getting that information to the local level, I think, is going to become really key. So getting good data and making that data available to everybody at all levels, I think, is critical. And we're, of course, doing some of that work. Hopefully, we'll talk a little bit about the severe and some of the systems we're putting in place to make some of that data available. The second thing that we need to do is to build capacity. And you mentioned this a little bit, and I think it's easy to be critical. But what I see when I travel in this region really is a sincere interest in trying to make lives better and try to find sustainable solutions for development. I think we need to continue to invest in building the tools that will enable this region to succeed. There's a number of good examples of this that are happening through the Lower Mekong Initiative. The Sustainable Infrastructure for the Mekong Initiative, again, the USAID program, working closely with the Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, is really doing a lot to build the capacity of these countries to look at infrastructure, where some of these decisions are still being made, as you pointed to look at some of this infrastructure, what the impacts will be, and what kind of changes that you can make to ensure that infrastructure will continue to deliver for the people in the long term. So capacity building, I think, is still key, and I think there's a lot of potential there. The third area I think I'd focus on is continuing to invest. Investments are critically important in terms of driving learning and driving cooperation. There's nothing better than actual tangible progress on the ground to maintain public support and to build political will for cooperation. And so continued investments is important, demonstrating progress on the ground through projects and programs, through joint projects and programs, I think is critical in terms of incentivizing continued cooperation and continued working together. The fourth area I'd focus on, I think we really need functioning bilateral and regional mechanisms at all levels that can provide meaningful opportunities for joint planning and cooperation on development projects, especially those that can have regional impacts. And you both pointed to the need for this. We can have a conversation around whether or not the MRC is the right platform for all of that. But I think the reality is that communities, countries, regions need platforms where they can talk together, where they can share data about their own development needs and challenges, and about how they can work cooperatively to manage a shared system to achieve their own goals and objectives. It's easy to say this, it's incredibly hard to do, but when these systems work, they can be incredibly powerful. And then I think the last thing is that all of us, and I mean that from a donor perspective, I mean it from the countries, I mean it from the private sector, I mean it from the people on the ground, we need to commit to a sustainable future for the Mekong. We all need to be much more conscious about how the decisions that we're making today could impact the potential of future generations in the region, and we need to act accordingly. We need to make this part of our consciousness and our engagement within the region. I think there are many good examples of how you can do this throughout the world. We can talk about some of these today. Not to brag, but well, maybe just a little bit. The United States and Mexico have made a lot of progress recently in this last year in strengthening our relationship to build our resiliency to drought and resiliency to climate change. And I think there's some lessons learned that we can begin to export and talk about what we've done to change that relationship and that dynamic. But I think what's clear is that with the same level of commitment, the lower Mekong countries can achieve a more water secure future. And we've seen through these pictures that people within the region, they need the water they need, where they need it, when they need it to continue to produce the food that they need, the energy that they need to protect themselves from floods and droughts. And I think we can do all of this while preserving what I think is one of the world's most critical river systems, one of the most unique river systems that we've got in this world, both now and into the future. So maybe I'll stop there and make sure we have time for conversation.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Just one quick question. You mentioned bilateral cooperation. Do you differentiate between, for instance, is it more productive for country A to cooperate with country B and country B to country C, or than regional cooperation?
I think generally the way I've seen this play out in other places in the world is that cooperation at the lowest appropriate level makes sense.
Got it.
And so, if you've got a sub-basin set of challenges, working at the sub-basin level makes a lot of sense. If you've got a basin, you don't want to take on a challenge, or you don't want to take you don't want to bring in actors who really don't have a legitimate role in solving that problem into a process.
Mm-hmm.
It just makes the process more cumbersome.
Great. Thank you. Todd.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to thank the Stimson Center for this opportunity this afternoon to talk to you about some of the USAID aspects of this topic. My name is Todd Johnson. I'm a Forestry and Climate Change Advisor in the Asia Bureau of USAID on the Environmental Security and Resilience team in our Office of Technical Services. And that role gives me the pleasure of being able to spend quite a bit of my time in the region, in the field, which fits very much with my 30-year career, most of which was spent overseas, living in various parts of the world, and probably more than half of that within Asia, different parts of Asia. I think we've heard quite a bit about some of the challenges, the transnational challenges in the region in terms of that energy security, food security, and water security, and how those things interconnect in that very dynamic context, environmentally, developmentally, and climatically. And so what I'm going to do this afternoon is kind of walk through some of the specific parts of the mosaic of activities that USAID is engaged in to address different parts of this overall puzzle. First, all of these things that I'm going to be describing fit under a broad umbrella of the Climate Change and Development Strategy that was approved by USAID in January of 2012 to support the implementation of the President's Global Climate Change Initiative. And that strategy has basically three main pieces to it. One is investments in clean energy and sustainable landscapes, or mitigating climate change. Another is investments in adaptation. And then finally is integration of climate change into our programs across the board, with or without any specific climate change funding, as well as into evaluations and policy dialogues and operationally. What that translates into programmatically on the ground very much depends on the context. The Asia Bureau covers everything from the glaciers of Kazakhstan to the beaches of Fiji, and so there's no real one-size-fits-all that you could even begin to talk about in those terms. So I'm going to describe some of the things we're doing, sort of starting at that pan-regional level, and then gradually come down to the Delta area. On the mitigation side, we work in 7 countries across the region on the Enhancing Capacity for Low-Emission Development Strategies, EC-LEDs. Now, LEDs are basically a strategic planning, analytical, and policy process to help countries sort of shift their direction of their economies, try to de-link emissions growth from economic growth, bending the curve, as it's called, so that they can increase their economic performance and efficiency while reducing their long-term emissions trajectory. On the adaptation side, sort of regionally, we're working with the National Snow and Ice Data Center of the University of Colorado at Boulder for a project called Contribution to High Asia Runoff from Ice and Snow, or CHERIS. You can Google that and have all their details on that. Basically, CHERIS is systematically trying to document and analyze what's happening to the glaciers, put some solid data, build an evidence base for the role that glaciers and seasonal snows play in providing fresh water for rivers across the region. It works in 9 countries, from the eastern Himalayas of Bhutan on around to the Chanshan in Kazakhstan, in 5 major river basins that support close to 2 billion people. And then the Tibetan Plateau, which is nearby, of course, another 5 major rivers, including the Mekong, the Salzberg, and others. Also in High Asia, we're working with the World Wildlife Fund to build the adaptive capacity of the communities who live up in those areas, while also conserving the snow leopard habitat. Snow leopard is a good sort of proxy indicator for general health of those high mountain ecosystems. If you need to pick one charismatic species to be paying attention to sort of draw attention to the changes taking place in those high altitude locations, then snow leopard is a very good one, if you can find one. Camera traps have seen some recently. We've got a few with some greater colors, so we're getting there. And we're working with, it's called the Conservation and Adaptation in Asia's High Mountain Landscapes and Communities Program, or AHM. We're working with conservationists, communities, and climate scientists in high mountain areas of Nepal, Bhutan, India, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Mongolia on that. And then coming further downstream, from the Bangkok office in the Mekong region, we've got the Sustainable Infrastructure Mekong program that Aaron talked about. And basically, what that does is work with the partner governments in the region, all of the LMI partner countries, providing technical assistance from some of the U.S. government's best engineers and scientists across the government to help mitigate some of the potential negative impacts of some of the infrastructure developments and the environmental and social consequences of those. We're also in a program called Mekong Program for the Environment, Partnership for the Environment, sorry, MPE, working with civil society to also build their capacity to sort of serve as watchdogs and strengthen the stakeholders' ability to network with one another and share information, again, around some of the infrastructure planning and investments that are taking place across the region. And we're also supporting the Asia-LEDS partnership, which is working with the countries in the region on those low emission development strategies and building climate resilience into their government processes. I think some of the people who attended the negotiations for the Paris Climate Agreement said that, you know, the several years of work that we've been doing through EC-LEDS, working with the governments in the region, kind of gave them the technical confidence in their own abilities, and that they had the competence to be able to put forward a nationally determined contribution that then helped build the momentum for an agreement that can take place. So it's one of those step-by-step processes that resulted in the Paris Agreement. The Asia-LEDS partnership, Vietnam currently actually co-chairs that. We're working with 300 different government and non-government experts on the tools and practices, sort of the nuts and bolts, day-to-day, some of that capacity building that's been discussed already. Of, you know, how do you get that ability, the skill sets to be able to integrate some of these things into the decision-making processes, and so that they know how to fish and they're able to fish. When Vietnam was preparing its intended nationally determined contribution, several times either through our USAID office in Hanoi or through the embassy, offered to work with them to help them run their numbers, and they were like, thanks but no thanks, we got it covered. So we're like, okay, let's see what they actually did a pretty good job. So they had that technical competence and confidence to be able to put something, and it was important for them to say, we did this. It wasn't something that they handed off to the UNDP consultants to do. They did it themselves. And then one of the other things we're working at that regional level is called Adapt Asia Pacific. And that basically is helping some of the countries in the region to how to access some of the international adaptation funds. What do they need to do to their internal financial management systems and things? Sharing best practices from country to country, learning peer-to-peer exchanges, things like that, on how to meet the requirements of the different climate funds that are out there, to be able to then find access resources for their own development. Part of that not having an over-reliance on donor funding, because eventually we hope a lot of private sector funds will also be pulled into the Green Climate Fund and some of these other mechanisms. Aaron mentioned Severe. I don't actually work that closely with Severe. That's actually run out of our global bureau because it's a global network. But there is one based in Bangkok, Severe Mekong. Essentially what it does, it's a partnership between USAID, State Department, NASA, and a few other agencies of the US government to bring the data and skill sets to help address questions. So it's a demand-driven. Countries say, okay, we want to address this question, and it's, how can we help to compile from available data sets or generate new data sets to be able to then provide some information so that decision processes are better informed. And then before we get to the Delta itself, I want to just briefly touch on some of the things we're doing in Cambodia, because as many of you probably know, the Tonle Sap is sort of the bladder of the Mekong, and what happens in the Tonle Sap can very much affect what happens in the Delta itself. Probably our flagship program in Cambodia dealing with climate change is HARVEST, which stands for Helping Address Rural Vulnerabilities and Ecosystem Stability. HARVEST is good enough. Almost nobody knows what it actually means. And that's working in the 4 provinces around Tonle Sap, focusing on reducing poverty and malnutrition in those 4 provinces, with productivity enhancement, addressing some of the post-harvest losses, malnutrition, which is actually quite high, access to markets, just physical access, being able to get product to market, some of the environmental degradation that comes with things like subsidized fertilizers and pesticides, as well as, of course, the effects of climate change. It's not really made the news in the U.S., but the drought has been pretty severe in Cambodia as well. There were livestock dropping dead in some of the provinces around Tonle Sap, for example. Why it made the British press but not the American press, I don't know. I'm not a journalist. Some of the other things we're doing with World Fish, we're partnering with them to work on rice field fisheries and improve the productivity and environmental sustainability of the fisheries. That's a huge source of protein for most of the rice farmers in Cambodia around the Tonle Sap area. And so World Fish is one of the CGIAR research centers, and so they're looking at how can that enhancement of productivity, working on fish refuges in communities, more than 1,000 of these refugees that they're working on. And then finally in Cambodia, the Supporting Forest and Biodiversity Program is more on the mitigation side, trying to reduce emissions from deforestation and land degradation in the eastern plains, which go over toward Vietnam, and then also Prelong, which sits across a couple of the rivers that feed into the Tonle Sap. And finally, because that's why most of you are here, is to talk about Vietnam, some of the things that we're doing there.
Todd, if I
Yes.
could, we want to
We're
get
running out of
to
time?
time for Q&A.
Okay,
So
sure.
yeah, thanks.
Sure.
Not that we don't want to hear about you.
Okay, thanks. At the sort of policy level, we're working with the government of Vietnam on their Vietnam Green Growth Strategy and helping them move that towards implementation. It's effectively their LEDS, their Low Emission Development Strategy. They prefer the term green growth, so that's fine. And there's an action plan, and we're partnering with the Ministry of Planning and Investment on that. We've got a couple of clean energy programs. One working with the Ministry of Construction, another one with the Ministry of Energy and Trade. One is focused on modeling of low emission from the different options in the energy sector. And then the other is looking at green building standards in most of the major cities in Vietnam. You may be thinking, okay, why are we talking so much about mitigation instead of adaptation? If we don't slam on the brakes, I'm speaking for myself, not as a U.S. government, if we don't slam on the brakes, we cannot as a species adapt fast enough. And so we need to adjust mitigation and get the emissions reductions. Vietnam is on a trajectory to sort of go off the charts, and so that's one reason we're focusing quite a bit on mitigation there as well. On the adaptation side, our primary vehicle currently is called Vietnam Forests and Deltas. It's working in both the Red River and Mekong Deltas, upstream in the forest zones, and then downstream in the deltas itself. One of our implementing partners in that is the International Red Cross. They're doing a lot of disaster preparation, disaster risk reduction, disaster management with schools, community groups, just across the Delta region. And that's primarily with the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. Maybe I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions if anyone has.
Thank you. I have a question, but I'll hold mine. And let's get some reaction from our participants here, or questions. So the floor is open. Anyone? Yes. Identify yourself, please.
I'm Keith Curtis. I'm working with Harris Corporation. I worked with the Department of Commerce for 30 years. I appreciate, Todd, especially that you talked about the need for, the starting point is a need for good data and looking for the whole region. Of course, Harris Corporation has interests as we supply NOAA with their weather information, and as well as looking at the water. So I'd be interested to know where you see the greatest needs and how much confidence you have. We've been talking about a 100-year drought, but this is obviously something more than a cyclical. And you have a confidence of what is dividing what is natural cyclical weather conditions, or what is really climate change, because after all, this is entitled climate change, right? So I'm going to be looking at the glacier effects as originating all the problems. So maybe just a little bit of your feeling about where the biggest needs for the data are and what your confidence is in the data, and in terms of the long-term and short-term effects. That's a big enough question.
You probably have a better window on the water-related data.
Arg. Where do you start? Everything from, we don't even know the fish species in many of these river systems, more or less how they behave and respond to different changes in the environment. I don't think we understand the current state of land management within the region, and have good maps of what's going on, where it's going on, and how these things are happening. We don't know what's happening. So first, there's the whole monitoring of where we are. What's the baseline? And then putting a system in place where we can manage and understand changes from that baseline today. Then we get into the whole set of issues that you were talking about, which is how do we look forward into the future? You know, how do we collect the right hydrometeorological data, package that up in the right way, process it, and get it in some meaningful format out to the countries with some sort of confidence in what we've got. And obviously, we're going to struggle with that. What we know, 2 days from now versus 6 weeks from now versus 6 months from now. 6 months from now, it's getting a lot better than it was, 5 years ago. I'm actually quite impressed. But 5 years, 10 years from now, we don't know. And that's the real challenge when it comes to some of this big infrastructure, is understanding what the hydrologic environment is going to look like 30, 40, 50 years from now. And I think that argues for us to do two things. One, we need all that data to understand what the environment's going to look like, and we try to make it as precise as we can. But the other is we need to take approaches that will give us much greater flexibility in the future on how we want to manage these water systems. And that often argues for smaller pieces of infrastructure spread out, so that you can turn certain parts off, certain parts on, take certain parts out, rearrange, make the system as adaptable as possible so that we can change it given these changing hydrologic conditions. And so I think that argues against large single pieces of infrastructure. And that's something I think we're going to have to think a lot more about going forward in this region in particular. Sorry, I got a little bit off track.
Could I jump in there, because it ties together this question and what I was going to comment about, and that is that we're all talking here about software rather than hardware, and in the big sense that, in other words, yes, it's probably a good idea. We're not involved in big infrastructure projects anymore. Big infrastructure projects are probably not what's needed. But on the other hand, under the work that's being done under the LMI, and Todd, you rattled off a lot of initiatives. Critics say, well, you're just doing a lot of stuff that's not visible. Nobody knows what actually the LMI does. And one issue maybe is there not enough money to put into it. But the other is just that what do you get back from it in terms of cooperation with the governments, and either with each other or with the programs? In other words, what kind of response is coming from these, and are you confident, are you comfortable with how it's playing out?
Well, maybe just a quick response. I mean, this is Washington. I'm always amazed what you can do if you don't want to take credit. And I think the same thing is true in the regions, to be frank. I mean, look, we're dealing with very bright individuals who want to be seen as being able to do their jobs proficiently. And I think if we can work with them in a quiet way so that they can project a more confident and thoughtful and analytically and data-based view, then we're succeeding. And if they can do that with partners who, if they heard the U.S. was involved, might not necessarily take that guidance, then we've done even better. And so these are very complicated regions, complicated dynamics. I think the quiet approach makes a lot of sense in regions like this, and I think we should continue to do that.
We're seeing that as well within, for example, one of the reasons that Vietnam came forward with an INDC in Paris was because the Philippines was going to. So those peer pressures and having, knowing that they're somebody who's in their same strata is also doing something, then they sort of feed off of each other and really encourage one another to kind of keep raising things. But if it was the U.S. coming in saying you should do this, then they're going to say, well, thanks, we don't.
So this is where I think there's a potential opportunity there for Vietnam to raise its level of leadership capacity in the region, and for other states to see that type of ramping up going on. And again, if it's seen as a positive contribution to sustainability, then the reaction would be similar. This would not be a negative effect. The compounding would produce momentum that would be very effective for the region.
I mean, and it's not to say that there aren't times where a U.S. presence or a U.S. voice or a convening power might not be helpful. And in particular, I think that's building a sensitivity and awareness to a lot of these issues. And there are times where I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think we see some of that with the LMI.
Yeah, it's amazing to think, again, historically, all these dam projects on the mainstream and a number of them on the tributaries, they were all laid out. Those sites were all picked by the Bureau of Reclamation and the Tennessee Valley Authority experts after the war. And in fact, during the war, in fact, they even in the 30s they even cited the Three Gorges Dam for the then Chinese government. So But it's, obviously, that's progress, you know, and I do think having the opportunity to work in this area, that our relationships with governments, with scholars, with scientists, et cetera, in the region, that is American relationships, are amazingly good. And the countries can only go so fast, obviously. But I think it's a striking contrast to even our past role in the region, not to mention, for instance, China's big project role. Yeah. But thank you.
And that's the real challenge, is trying to balance the need to develop and the real pressure to deliver, water and energy to the region, with building the capacity so that these countries can actually do these things. And that's a very tough dynamic everywhere.
Yeah. Well, then there's other part of this too, and that is that what Americans seem to do best is our cooperation across bureaucratic lines, and what makes it happen is the personal element. In other words, it's individuals. When state started the LMI, they didn't talk to USAID or anybody else. Then they had to scurry around and try to get other departments and agencies involved, and of course USAID was first, but Commerce, Energy, U.S. Geological Survey was in there. So, but the main point is all the people that had responsibility to work on these issues work with each other across those lines. They all have a personal commitment, which is, I think, is very, very remarkable, and it's one of the things that says one of the best things about our system, actually.
Yeah, I'm sorry I was a little late, and you might have mentioned this, but what is the natural the historical seasonal cycle in terms of fresh water flow in the main channel? And do farmers in the Delta already know how to adapt somewhat to salinity? I mean, are there times of the year where, where it is higher salt water, and the balance is not quite right? And do they know how to grow crops in brackish water?
So that today kind of marks the end of the traditional, today, because the news coming out of Myanmar was the monsoon season has arrived this weekend, the end of the dry season. However, and then that runs more intensely through the summer, and then tapers off October, November, to no precipitation, almost no precipitation between November and now.
December's the best month. December, January, the best months to travel out there. Right? It's drier and cooler. Yeah.
And don't let the monsoon season discourage travel. Just a little piece out there.
It doesn't rain all the time.
It doesn't rain all the time. It's the coolest time of the year, actually. April and March are the hottest times of the year. But as far as adaptation, maybe the both of you can comment on this as well from your time spent there. But you see pockets of adaptation. Like there's sugar cane that can grow decently well in the brackish conditions, alongside of no rice in the rice paddy. The Vietnamese are beginning to develop rice varieties that will adapt to high salt content water. So that's coming in. It's not quite there yet. And again, the aquaculture as well is the response. The shrimping that can thrive within a brackish condition, but you still need to have the fresh water there, and that requires a lot more fresh water than to create that mix that can be brought up from the ground.
Just to mention, I know this has come up in the LMI context, where there's a body of an indigenous knowledge that we're not really taking good advantage of, and that the ability of communities across the region, so experiences in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, to talk to each other about some of the indigenous knowledge that exists and what might be useful more broadly, is something that we need to work to try to make happen. So it's something that I think is being recognized.
And rice, just very quickly, rice is a policy that is promoted at the national level, as well as overemphasized at certain local levels, like within those circle dike areas. So, and rice has its own indigenous roots, but the over-intensification of rice that we're seeing, this new vein, is something new. It's a new innovation.
Barry?
So this is mainly for Todd, but for everybody.
Barry, identify yourself.
Barry Naughton, I do China economics. at the University of California, San Diego. What's the role of China in the network of cooperation relations that you described so well earlier? Are they active, non-participant?
Well, the programs that I described are the ones that USAID supports. We do have some areas of cooperation, collaboration with China, not in any of these specific things.
So they're not in any particular
LMC.
No.
This might be a good opportunity to discuss
It's
LMC.
more of a, it's a separate track.
What about measuring the glacier?
Sorry?
Not even measuring the glacier melt?
They have some researchers who are interested in joining the network. I mean, the question earlier about some of the data, one of the early lessons from that Cheris project on the glaciers is that having standard data protocols from Bhutan to Kazakhstan is really helping those that research community figure out what's going on a meso scale, maybe even a macro scale, instead of this basin. Because one of the challenges is that there's a lot of different sort of data points out there, but you can't really roll them up. You can't compare them across because this researcher used that methodology and somebody else used a different methodology. And you can't blend the data to really be able to then get a bigger picture of what exactly is happening.
But China provides no data almost for flows.
Sorry?
China provides almost no data on
No,
flows.
no.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm sure they
Which is
know, but
kind of a tricky problem.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
just to bring China in the picture a little bit more, there's the newly founded Lancang Mekong Cooperation Mechanism, which is China-led, and it's bringing the other states of the Mekong into a multilateral negotiation table or regional economic integration promotion platform with an aspect of water resource management. And it started out as a response to the growing needs for shared water cooperation within the region, and then quickly turned into a money vehicle that overemphasizes economic investment opportunities and connectivity. So water gets squeezed within that. But hopefully, and it's again, we don't know, that this will provide some type of flow of data to the region, because currently China only releases its wet season hydrological flow data, and that's not what's needed. What's needed is now. Again, so Vietnam can say, well, we know how much China is not contributing, but should be contributing to the region, and then can begin to take care of their own issues.
But to the other side of this equation is that before the meeting in Hainan Island of this Lower Mekong Cooperation Mechanism, the Chinese call it, a senior official or spokesperson from the Commerce Department of China gave a press release. It had this press release that essentially said to the countries, the other countries, downstream countries, that it's only natural that China, being the upstream riparian, is more concerned about water and has more opportunities to use water than the others. And then he said, for the downstream countries, let's stop arguing about water. Downstream countries should not worry about water so much as they should take advantage of the $10 billion in investment capital that China is willing to provide for industrial development, industrialization, and integration of those economies with the Chinese economy. And it was, to me, it was stunning that anyone would almost say, the water, forget about it. That's all we're taking care of. Now, we're giving you an opportunity to do something else. They literally said something else than rely on water for your national, your economic sustainability.
And we perceive the region currently as one being in flux, particularly with many states reaching out to the United States for assistance and integrated water support, strategic planning for shared water resources, hydropower, so that there's this very fluid situation. And China's response is the same stuff, throw money at the problem. So I feel that the more the Mekong is changing, the more China is staying the same. So there needs to be some type of shift there within China to get in the ball game.
Yeah, well, and to go back to the comment I made at the beginning on Stimson's approach, I mean, we've been trying to look at this from a perspective of, yeah, we're concerned about the environment, about fisheries, food security, all those things, but who's making the decisions about these projects, dam projects and other infrastructure? Where's the money? Follow the money. Where's the money interest in these things? And what we've been trying to do is sort of help along the rising political and financial risk to these projects. So things are changing, and this drought is an example of how, you know, conceivably 30 years from now, China's whole massive cascade in Yunnan could become a white elephant, or at least maybe a little more than storage, water storage, because there won't be enough, conceivably there won't be enough water there. And and the downstream countries are, you know, there was an engineering study done for the Salzberg Dam in Laos by some Thai engineers, and when they got to the question of, well, how many months through the year will this dam operate, they just had to say, well, we don't know how much water will be available like during the dry season. We're just assuming that the operation of the Chinese dams to generate power will mean that there'll be enough water in the river. Well, that's not the way it's played out in the last 5 or more years. And so if you're an investor in a project on the Lao or Lao-Thai border, or even in Cambodia, you know, you would think that that people with a longer term view would say, maybe this isn't such a good idea. And the Vietnamese are, I think, a little bit ahead of other countries in realizing that a lot of the dams they built have not panned out in terms of delivering reliable electricity, and investment is a lot of it wasted investment in this area.
Well, you guys tell me, but I mean, do you think some of the steps that happened, you know, during the drought, both requests that came from some of the downstream countries for extra releases from China, the fact that, you know, the MRC really didn't play a very helpful role, I think, in working with the countries to get through this. I mean, does that signal kind of a new positive direction that we might be able to move in some respects, and is opening up a discourse that might not have existed before around? Or do you not see that as being progress?
So China's response?
Yeah.
No. I think it was taking advantage of a publicity opportunity right before the Hainan meeting to say we're releasing water. Why? Because China did it at the same time.
They did it twice, right? I mean,
they extended, right? So I guess that's
They did the same in 2010.
Well, not just 2010, but year on year before that, you could see these same releases. So it's just that's a new spin on an old tale, and it was done. I mean, the shock is so hard to some riparian communities that it causes floods overnight, and so the data might go, or the information on the release might go to the top levels at Thailand or Cambodia, but these communities get no notice. So boom.
Well, that's why I mentioned the MRC's role, I think, is at some point, and having a conversation about how they might manage that kind of a process in a cooperative way to ensure that those types of things, you know, didn't happen, and that any releases that do happen can be meaningfully used by the countries. I think is critical. And that, you know, that point's taking some of the challenges that we face with the MRC, and, you know, building an institution that can be responsive, you know, to the needs of the countries.
Yeah, and the MRC is on the edge right now because the donors, and particularly the European donors, are losing confidence in it and being less willing to provide support.
See, they shift to solar as a solution instead of hydro?
There is, yeah. That's a whole new, you're opening up a whole new area, but for instance, Laos has got lots of solar potential if they had a backup grid to provide backup to the deployment of solar, you know, and we're working on that. We have a big project and thrust on that, but it's a little too much to get into now. But definitely, hydro is solar makes so much more sense, and even in terms of transmission lines and building grids, we talked to an expert with hydropower, the transmission industry, electrical transmission industry in U.S. Courtney set up a call several months ago now, and the guy's saying, even here with all the regulations and all that stuff, environmental and other regulations, he said, we can still build a 500 volt transmission line, big line, for $1 million a mile. And he said, that's a lot cheaper than the $3.6 billion dam, or 9 dams between $2.5 to $3.5 billion that Laos plans, for instance. So there are other, and the cost, but a big problem is pricing. So, for instance, Vietnam subsidizes electricity to the point that it discourages some of these other ways of doing it. Thailand has opened up recently to allow people to feed into the grid with their own solar installations. But there's so much more that could be done. And in fact, when some experts did a strategic environmental assessment for the MRC on all these dam projects, they estimated that by 2030, if all these dams were built, they would only provide 6 to 8% of the total electricity consumption in the region, which we already know is, at least for Thailand, is always overestimated. But Thailand, the biggest market, could easily save 6 to 8% by 2030. So it's a who benefits, and how do you evaluate how broadly do you evaluate the cost and benefits of these things?
I think we have time for one very quick question with a very quick response, if there's one there that didn't get asked or answered.
Huh?
I'm sorry, I'm wondering, is there an engineering strategy to getting silt into the delta? Like, can dams be retrofitted that, in any way that would allow, maybe 20% more silt to pass through, or is that?
Yeah, they can. But that 20% of what?
I guess, yeah, I guess if you could tear them all out and rebuild them.
But the sedimentation mitigation cannot replicate the natural sediment flow that delivers consistently or through a natural process. So you're holding it back, and then you're lifting up a gate at one point to flush things out. When it's held back, the water is sediment poor, so it's trying to take other sediment off the side of a river, and
What kind of sediment? Is it the light sediment you were mentioning, or is it the heavy sediment? Again, it becomes incredibly complicated.
And put that chain behind 11 dams, where the delta's all the way at the bottom.
Right. Yeah.
And the future is not
using
right.
run-of-the-river solutions more and more.
Well, these are all technically, a lot of dams will be technically run-of-river dams, but they're still 32, 35 meter high dams.
Well, that's a storage dam. That's the largest one currently on the Mekong.
We're starting to look at in-river generation, where you're not building a dam across the rivers.
Yeah.
Stick a flying.
And I think it has potential. I think in many places, especially
Cambodia's looking at that for their two dams they're
there's
thinking
some potential to
about.
do that. I think you're absolutely right. We need to develop other sources of energy in those countries to pressure off the river systems. I think that gets back to financial flows. Who are the investors and how do you make all that work? Because dams are easy to build, and it's a cash cow for some of these investors who come in. And so how you make that happen in the other parts of the energy sector to take pressure off the system, that's tough. And how do you build people within the governments who are willing to take the risk on what they would consider to be new and novel approaches when the dam technology is ancient, and so these are things that they can learn and have confidence in that they can deliver. These are risks that are real risks that those people face out there making those decisions that we have to help them buy down, so to speak.
These are all these projects in Laos, for instance, are concessions sounds like the colonial era, doesn't it? Concessions, that they're concessions because Laos doesn't have any money to put into the projects, and they're looking for the quick buck of taxes and export revenues, to Thailand and even Vietnam, and so there's no mechanism there, and that's why we go back to the issue that it's got to be. We have to focus on the economics of this and persuade people, if we can, that it's actually bad. It's going to be a bad return for them, and even for the developers, they're losing interest in 30 years, 30, 45 years. So build, own, operate, transfer issues. I mean, look at China Power Investments and the Mitsone Dam project in Myanmar. I mean, they're stunned. We talked to them and they're going, we want our money back, or we want to build the projects. And well, they haven't got the money. Allowed. I mean, the Burmese don't have the money, and they're not gonna. We don't know what's gonna happen whether they can build the projects again. But the risk is rising, including financial risk.
And you tell me if you think this is the case for Vietnam, but I think generally for the region, there's a large stakeholder and gender component in this that's actually missing that might drive some of the decisions in a different direction. And I'm often stunned, particularly when we start taking gender balance into consideration for our discussions, how much the discussions immediately shift to other alternatives. I mean, I think the gender perspective on these sets of issues is quite remarkable, and it really is a different development pathway that I think we see when we take those gender perspectives into account. How you get that working in these types of governments and countries and regions, really challenging, but I know I've seen that.
So that's more than just a tick box, ticking off the gender,
I struggle with this quite a bit because, my example, of course, is when I went to school, even the women who went to school with me were trained to think in a male way. And the way we solve problems.
Because there's a few of them.
What I've noticed in a lot of the gender discussions that we've been having in the region is that there's a fundamental difference in how you solve problems and how you respond to problems that are much more community-based, much more environmental-based, much more systemic-based in an integrated way. That is something I think we benefit from. So how you make that happen in the planning of projects. And it's not just a representational issue, I think it really is a thinking issue. I haven't quite figured out how to make that happen.
But Vietnam's probably potentially the leader in that.
I think so.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank Aaron, Todd, and Brian in particular, and all of you for coming and giving all us your attention. It's been a good, rich discussion, and we hope to see you here for more of them. But I think